My grandson begged me, Grandma, don't drink the punch. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. Because when a child says something like that at a family gathering, you assume it's silly. But the way he said it, his hand gripping mine, his voice shaking, his eyes full of fear, made my stomach drop. And when I looked across the room and realized who made that punch, that laugh disappeared instantly. Ethan's warning didn't come from imagination or mischief, and it certainly wasn't a child trying to get attention. It came from instinct, the kind of instinct children have before the world teaches them to stay quiet and ignore the unease in their stomach. When he grabbed his grandmother's hand, his fingers weren't playful or sticky with sugar, they were tight, almost desperate, as if he was afraid that letting go for even a second would be too late. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. His eyes were wide and searching her face, not for permission to misbehave, but for reassurance that she was listening, that she believed him, that she would be safe. Children see things adults dismiss. They hear conversations people think are private. They notice when voices drop, when instructions are whispered instead of spoken openly. Ethan had been close enough to hear something he was never supposed to carry, and it weighed on him like a secret too heavy for a child his age. Being told not to tell made it worse. That kind of instruction doesn't feel normal to a child, especially when it involves someone they love. It creates fear, confusion, and a sense that something bad is about to happen. He didn't have the words to explain it clearly, but his body knew it wasn't right, and his fear found its way out in the only way it could, a quiet plea to protect his grandmother. That moment mattered more than anyone realized at the time. A small voice, barely heard over laughter and clinking glasses, stood between safety and disaster. Ethan didn't understand chemicals or dosages, or the danger hidden behind a sweet smell and bright color, but he understood intention. He understood when something felt wrong, and he trusted that feeling enough to act on it. That trust is something adults often lose. Years of social conditioning teach people to be polite, not cause scenes, not assume the worst. Ethan hadn't learned that yet. His loyalty was simple and pure. Someone he loved was in danger, so he spoke. The courage it takes for a child to go against an adult's instruction is enormous. He wasn't just breaking a rule, he was risking disapproval, punishment, or being called a liar. Children are taught early to obey parents, to stay quiet, to mind their place. For Ethan to step outside of that conditioning shows how deeply alarmed he was. His fear outweighed his obedience, and that alone speaks volumes about the seriousness of what he sensed. He wasn't trying to get someone in trouble. He was trying to keep someone alive. What makes this moment even more powerful is how easily it could have been brushed aside. A laugh, a pat on the head, a casual "it's fine" could have ended the story right there. Many adults would have dismissed it, telling themselves a child doesn't know better, that family gatherings are safe by default, that paranoia has no place at a party. But listening changed everything. Taking that warning seriously created space for awareness instead of denial. It turned a potential tragedy into a moment of clarity. Ethan's warning didn't just stop a sip of punch, it interrupted a pattern of quiet harm that had been building for years. His voice exposed something that had been hidden behind smiles and social norms. In that instant, the power dynamic shifted. A child, often the least protected and least believed person in any room, became the most truthful. His honesty cut through manipulation in a way no adult argument could. Later, when he spoke again and confirmed what he had been told not to share, it sealed the truth permanently. This kind of bravery often goes unrecognized because it doesn't look dramatic. There was no screaming, no running, no dramatic interruption of the party. Just a whisper, a grip of a hand, a plea. But that is how real protection often begins, quietly, vulnerably, without certainty of being believed. Ethan didn't know the outcome. He only knew he had to try. That willingness to act without knowing the result is what makes his warning so powerful. Long after the event, that moment became a reminder of how important it is to listen to children, especially when they speak from fear rather than mischief. Their instincts are often sharper because they haven't learned to rationalize danger away. They haven't been trained to prioritize comfort over truth. Ethan's warning was a gift of awareness, one that demanded courage both from the one who spoke and the one who chose to listen. What made the situation truly dangerous wasn't a single cruel decision made in a moment of anger, but the slow, quiet build-up of disrespect that had been unfolding for years. The kind of disrespect that never announces itself loudly, never leaves visible bruises, and is easy to excuse when viewed in isolation. It starts small, almost harmless, dressed up as jokes, forgetfulness, or personality differences. But over time, those small moments stack on top of each other, forming a pattern that reveals intention rather than accident. In this case, that pattern was rooted in control, resentment, and a deep need to assert dominance over someone seen as weak or disposable. From the beginning, Karen's behavior wasn't openly hostile. It was strategic. She smiled when others were watching, played the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law, and made sure her cruelty stayed just subtle enough to be dismissed if ever questioned. A comment here, an eye roll there, a harmless joke at someone else's expense. Each act carried plausible deniability, which made it even more effective. If confronted, she could easily claim misunderstanding or sensitivity. This allowed her to maintain a sense of superiority while keeping her image intact, a combination that often emboldens people to push boundaries further. As time passed, those boundaries moved. Forgetting to share important information became routine. Decisions were made without consultation. Basic courtesy was withheld selectively. Meals were unequal, invitations were inconsistent, and kindness was rationed as a form of control. None of these actions alone would have justified alarm, but together they created an environment where one person's comfort was consistently prioritized while another's dignity was quietly eroded. This imbalance fed resentment on one side and power on the other, creating a dangerous dynamic that thrived in silence. The most insidious part of quiet disrespect is how it trains the victim to minimize their own discomfort. After years of being treated as an inconvenience, it becomes easier to rationalize mistreatment than to challenge it. Thoughts like "it's not worth causing trouble," or "that's just how she is," become coping mechanisms. This normalization of disrespect doesn't just protect the aggressor, it conditions them to believe they can go further without consequence. When no one pushes back, control feels justified, and cruelty begins to feel earned. Karen's resentment didn't come from nowhere. It was fueled by the presence of someone she couldn't fully dominate. An older woman with history, with family ties, with a role that couldn't be erased. To someone seeking control, that kind of presence can feel threatening. Instead of confronting her own insecurity, Karen redirected it outward, using subtle humiliation to reinforce a hierarchy where she stood on top. Over time, this need for dominance shifted from emotional to physical risk, a line crossed not in rage, but in calculation. The move from quiet disrespect to dangerous intent often happens when the aggressor believes they are untouchable. Years of unchecked behavior create confidence, even arrogance. They start to believe their actions will never be questioned, that their victim will never fight back, and that anyone else will side with them by default. This false sense of security is what makes escalation possible. It allows someone to justify increasingly harmful actions while still seeing themselves as the victim or the one in control. What makes this escalation particularly chilling is how ordinary it appears on the surface. A family gathering. A shared meal. A drink offered with a smile. These familiar settings lower defenses and create trust, making them the perfect cover for harm. Karen relied on that trust, on the assumption that family equals safety, that no one would suspect malice in such a setting. The danger wasn't just in the act itself, but in how comfortably it fit into a familiar routine. This progression reveals an important truth about harm within families. It rarely starts with extreme actions. It begins with entitlement, with the belief that someone else's comfort matters less. It grows through silence and avoidance, through years of choosing peace over accountability. By the time it reaches a critical point, it often shocks everyone involved, not because the signs weren't there, but because they were ignored for so long. The shock comes from realizing that what felt like minor disrespect was actually the foundation for something far more serious. Understanding this pattern matters, because it challenges the idea that dangerous people always look dangerous. Sometimes they look helpful, charming, even generous. Sometimes they host parties, make drinks, and laugh at the table. The warning signs aren't in their public performance, but in the private moments of control, the subtle ways they test how much they can get away with. When those tests go unanswered, they escalate, believing the silence is permission. This story serves as a reminder that quiet disrespect is never harmless. It is a language, and when spoken repeatedly, it reveals intent. Paying attention to those small moments isn't about being suspicious or paranoid, it's about recognizing patterns before they become irreversible. Because once someone convinces themselves that another person's well-being is secondary to their own sense of power, the line between emotional harm and physical danger becomes dangerously thin. In moments of betrayal, the instinct to react immediately can be overwhelming. Anger rises, fear takes over, and the urge to confront, accuse, or expose feels almost impossible to resist. That instinct is human, and often justified. But there are times when reacting too quickly gives power back to the very person who caused the harm. In this situation, silence was not surrender, it was strategy. Choosing not to explode in that moment created space to see clearly, to think deliberately, and to regain control over a situation that could have easily spiraled into chaos. Remaining calm after realizing something was wrong with the punch wasn't easy. Every emotion demanded expression: shock at the betrayal, anger at the risk taken, fear over what could have happened. But silence allowed those emotions to settle into focus instead of panic. By not confronting Karen immediately, the narrator avoided tipping her off, avoided giving her time to destroy evidence, change her story, or manipulate others into questioning what had happened. Silence preserved the truth while emotions were still raw and facts were still intact. There is a difference between staying quiet out of fear and staying quiet out of intention. This silence was deliberate. It was chosen not to protect the aggressor, but to protect the truth. Leaving the gathering calmly, citing lightheadedness, created a believable exit without raising suspicion. That choice mattered. It prevented a scene that could have been dismissed as drama or misunderstanding. It allowed the situation to remain grounded in reality rather than emotion, which later made it impossible to deny. Gathering evidence required patience. Taking the punch for testing was not an act of revenge, but of self-respect and self-preservation. It was a quiet declaration that the truth mattered more than immediate validation. Evidence doesn't argue, doesn't raise its voice, doesn't get accused of exaggeration. It exists, undeniable and solid. By waiting for confirmation, the narrator ensured that when the truth came out, it would stand on its own, immune to gaslighting or deflection. Silence also provided clarity about intent. Watching Karen's behavior after the punch was refused revealed more than any confrontation could have. Her annoyance instead of concern, her fixation on whether the drink was consumed, her subtle tension, these reactions spoke volumes. When people believe their plan has failed without knowing why, they often reveal themselves. Silence becomes a mirror, reflecting their true priorities and emotions. Had there been an immediate accusation, those insights would have been lost in defensive performance. Strategic silence also protected relationships that mattered. An emotional outburst at the party could have forced others to choose sides prematurely, often based on discomfort rather than truth. Family members might have rushed to defend Karen simply to restore peace, dismissing the concern as confusion or overreaction. By waiting, the narrator ensured that when the truth emerged, it would do so in a way that didn't demand belief, but earned it. This approach allowed others to confront reality without being pressured by emotional spectacle. When the moment of revelation finally arrived, silence transformed into authority. Presenting the lab report calmly shifted the power dynamic instantly. There was no need for raised voices or dramatic accusations. The facts spoke. The contrast between calm delivery and the gravity of the evidence made denial look weak and desperate. This is the power of restraint. It disarms manipulation by refusing to engage in it on its terms. Choosing silence also modeled strength for the children watching. It showed that control doesn't come from loudness or aggression, but from clarity and patience. Ethan witnessed not just protection, but wisdom. He saw that listening, thinking, and acting with purpose could dismantle wrongdoing more effectively than anger ever could. That lesson carries weight far beyond the moment, shaping how he might handle conflict and injustice in his own life. This kind of silence is often misunderstood. It can look like passivity to those who equate strength with confrontation. But true strength sometimes lies in the ability to pause, to observe, and to choose the right moment. It requires confidence in oneself and trust in the truth. Not everyone can do it, especially when emotions run high and the stakes are personal. But when done intentionally, silence becomes a tool that exposes lies rather than hiding them. In the end, silence didn't protect the wrongdoer, it isolated her. It gave her space to make mistakes, to reveal intent, and to underestimate the woman she thought she had power over. By the time the truth was revealed, it was too late to manipulate, deny, or escape consequences. Silence had done its work, not as an absence of action, but as a deliberate choice that allowed justice to arrive with certainty and strength when the truth finally surfaced. It didn't come from anger, evidence, or authority alone. It came from a child. And that was what made it impossible to escape. Karen had rehearsed denial long before that night ever arrived. She had excuses ready, explanations polished just enough to sound reasonable, and a confidence built on years of never being challenged. Adults often rely on complexity to blur accountability, hiding behind tone, wording, and emotional manipulation. But a child doesn't carry those layers. A child speaks plainly, and that simplicity has a power that cuts straight through deception. Ethan didn't raise his voice or accuse. He didn't understand legal language or consequences. He simply told the truth as he experienced it. "Mom told me not to tell." Those words landed heavier than any accusation could have, because they weren't strategic. They weren't emotional. They weren't defensive. They were raw, unfiltered honesty. In that moment, every explanation Karen had prepared collapsed under the weight of a statement that required no interpretation. There was nothing to twist, no angle to spin, no tone to criticize. It was either true, or it wasn't, and everyone in the room knew it was true. Adults can be dismissed as bitter, dramatic, or confused. Especially older women. Especially those who have endured years of quiet disrespect. But a child carries a different kind of credibility. There is an unspoken understanding that children don't fabricate fear like that they don't invent instructions whispered in secrecy unless those instructions were real. Ethan had no motive, no agenda, nothing to gain. He wasn't trying to punish anyone or protect himself. He was simply repeating something that never should have been said to him in the first place. The moment he spoke, the room changed. People who had been unsure suddenly became certain. Doubt didn't linger because the truth didn't arrive wrapped in anger or accusation. It arrived softly, almost innocently, and that made it devastating. Karen's reaction betrayed her before her words ever could. The color draining from her face, the hesitation before she spoke, the way her eyes avoided everyone else's, these were not the responses of someone falsely accused. They were the reactions of someone whose carefully constructed control had just shattered. There is something uniquely powerful about a truth spoken by someone who doesn't yet know how to lie well. Children haven't learned how to manipulate narratives to protect themselves. They don't test reactions or calculate outcomes. Ethan didn't scan the room to see who would support him. He didn't measure the risk of speaking. He spoke because the truth felt too heavy to hold inside. That purity stripped the situation of all ambiguity. It forced everyone present to confront what had happened without the comfort of denial. What also made his words so powerful was the contrast between secrecy and exposure. Being told not to tell is a red flag that adults recognize instinctively, especially when it involves harm. The phrase itself implies wrongdoing. It acknowledges awareness that something is wrong. When Ethan repeated that instruction out loud, it exposed intent more clearly than any test result ever could. It showed that the act wasn't accidental, wasn't careless, and wasn't misunderstood. It was planned, and that realization rippled through the room in silence. For Karen, control had always depended on keeping conversations contained, on making sure uncomfortable truths stayed hidden behind closed doors. Ethan's honesty shattered that containment. Once the truth was spoken openly, it could no longer be managed. There was no way to reframe it as a misunderstanding or mistake. The presence of a child's voice made the situation morally undeniable. Even those who might have been tempted to minimize or rationalize were forced to confront the reality of what had been done. This moment also reframed the entire story. It shifted the focus away from personalities and onto actions. It stopped being about whether someone was liked, trusted, or respected. It became about behavior and consequences. A child had been placed in a position where he was asked to carry a dangerous secret, and that alone was enough to change how everyone saw the situation. The truth didn't need embellishment. It didn't need persuasion. It stood on its own. Ethan's honesty didn't just expose the lie, it ended it. After that moment, there was no more pretending, no more smiling explanations, no more gaslighting. The power that had been built on silence evaporated instantly. What remained was accountability, unavoidable and permanent. A child's simple truth had done what years of endurance and quiet suffering could not. It forced the lie into the open, where it could no longer survive, and once spoken aloud, it could never be taken back. Revenge is often imagined as something loud and destructive, a dramatic confrontation that leaves everyone scorched in its wake. But real revenge, the kind that lasts, doesn't come from chaos. It comes from reclaiming what was taken and refusing to let harm define the rest of your life. In this case, revenge wasn't about humiliation or public shaming. It was about protection, truth, and the quiet restoration of peace. The outcome wasn't fueled by anger, but by resolve, and that difference is what made it powerful. When the truth finally surfaced, the natural expectation might have been rage or vengeance. Years of swallowed disrespect could have erupted all at once. But instead, the response was measured and intentional. The goal was never to destroy for the sake of destruction, but to make sure the harm stopped and could never happen again. That kind of revenge doesn't seek applause. It seeks safety. It seeks closure. It seeks to draw a firm boundary where there had once been none. The consequences that followed weren't imposed out of spite. They were the natural result of actions brought into the light. Accountability has a way of feeling like punishment to those who have avoided it for too long. Karen lost her position not because someone wanted revenge, but because she broke trust in a way that could not be repaired. Trust, once shattered, doesn't come back through apologies or excuses. It comes back through consistent integrity, and that integrity was absent. What made this outcome especially meaningful was that it preserved what truly mattered. The family didn't fracture beyond repair. The children weren't forced to choose between safety and loyalty. The truth allowed the right connections to remain intact while removing the one that caused harm. That is a rare outcome in family conflicts, where silence often protects the wrong person at the expense of everyone else. Here, the opposite happened. The silence was broken, and the family reorganized itself around honesty instead of fear. There is a deep sense of justice in walking away with dignity intact. No screaming matches. No bitter feuds. No endless rehashing of the past. Just a clear line drawn and respected. That clarity brought peace not just externally, but internally. Living without the constant tension of being watched, judged, or subtly undermined created space for healing. Revenge, in this sense, was the freedom to live without looking over one's shoulder. The greatest victory wasn't seeing someone else fall, it was standing taller afterward. It was knowing that boundaries were enforced without becoming what caused the harm in the first place. It was teaching the children, especially Ethan, that wrongdoing has consequences, but justice doesn't require cruelty. That lesson is far more lasting than any dramatic confrontation. It plants a seed of self-respect and courage that will grow long after the details of the conflict fade. Peace has a way of exposing who truly lost. While one side moved forward surrounded by love and honesty, the other was left isolated by their own choices. That isolation wasn't engineered, it was earned. When manipulation fails and control disappears, there is nothing left to hide behind. The loss of access, trust, and influence became the real punishment, far more effective than anger ever could have been. There is something deeply satisfying about knowing that survival itself can be an act of defiance. Continuing to show up, to love freely, to laugh again, and to create safe spaces is a form of revenge that cannot be taken away. It denies the wrongdoer the lasting impact they intended. It transforms harm into wisdom and fear into strength. The story doesn't end with bitterness, but with clarity, and that clarity becomes a shield for the future. True revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting free. It's about choosing peace over poison, truth over silence, and protection over politeness. It's about ensuring that those who come after you are safer, because you were brave enough to act when it mattered, and in that quiet victory, life moves forward unburdened, grounded, and whole, carrying forward a sense of justice that doesn't shout, but remains firm, steady, and unbreakable, leaving behind a future that feels lighter, safer, and finally, your own.